Nottinghamshire is a great place to live, work or visit. As your fire and rescue service, we are proud to say that we've been rated good at what we do in protecting and serving our communities. We are good at keeping people safe and secure, being efficient in how we do this, and at looking after our people. Nottinghamshire Fire and Rescue Service. When you need us, we are here for you.
Okay, everybody, shall we make a start? Good morning, everybody. Welcome to everybody for being here. Those members and officers, and colleagues from the FBU and others who are observing today's meeting. Welcome to our full Nottinghamshire and City of Nottingham Fire and Rescue Authority meeting on Friday the 24th of February. And thank you to colleagues at Highfield Station for hosting us again today for our full Fire Authority meeting. Just before we make a formal start in terms of the business, colleagues will know that today marks exactly 1 year on from Putin's full-scale illegal invasion of Ukraine. We will join in the national minute silence. We will pause and stand for a minute's silence at 11 o'clock this morning to show both our solidarity and support for all Ukrainians. So I will, wherever we are at in the agenda and in the discussion, draw the meeting to a pause a couple of minutes before 11 o'clock so we can stand and join in the minute's silence. I'll move on to the formal agenda. Any apologies for absence?
Councillor Turner.
Thank you very much. Kath, any other apologies for absence? No? Item 2 then is declarations of interest. Any declarations of interest by any members or officers? I'm not seeing any indications. Item 3, minutes of the meeting held on the 16th of December 2022. Anybody got any comments or questions they'd like to raise in relation to the minutes? I'm not seeing any indications. People happy to approve them as a correct record? They're agreed, colleagues. Thank you very much. Item 4 then is Chair's announcements. First of all, just in terms of the tragic loss of life of firefighter Barry Martin, on Monday the 13th of February, the service took part in a national silence in memory of firefighter Barry Martin from the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. Chief Fire Officer Craig Parkin, the Vice Chair of the Fire Authority, Patience of Fedora, and myself paid our respects alongside colleagues from across the service at Joint HQ, and I know that minute's silence was also held at many of our stations and by staff across the service. The 38-year-old from Fife sadly died, as people will have seen in the news, on Friday the 27th of January following serious injuries he sustained during a large-scale fire in a building in the centre of Edinburgh. His funeral took place on Friday the 17th of February in Edinburgh, and anybody who saw, I certainly saw the pictures. I think people in the service there and people across the country in Scotland did him incredibly proud, and it just goes to show the risk that is attached to being a firefighter or anybody who works in emergency services, and certainly our thoughts and prayers are with his family, his friends, and his family in Scottish Fire and Rescue Service as well. In terms of the pay offer, which we've discussed before here in the full authority and in a number of our committee meetings, colleagues will be aware that a revised pay offer of 7% has been made for our Grey Book establishment, with a further 5% effective from July this year. The Fire Brigades Union has recommended acceptance, but are now balloting appropriately their members. A decision hopefully will be reached by the 6th of March. Further details of what the pay offer means in terms of our individual service will be covered in today's meetings. I took part in those negotiations, and I'd just like to say that credit should be given to colleagues on both sides of the aisle in terms of that negotiation. I think it shows where people come around the room, have a conversation, engage, and try and reach middle ground and a compromise. The right position can be reached, and I just hope that this is a catalyst to what's going on in the rest of the country, that you've got to sit down and talk from either side. You've got to find common ground, and that way then you can move forward. Clearly a national strike would have been hugely disruptive to residents here in the city and county, and I'm certainly very grateful for colleagues from the trade unions who sat on the other side of the aisle for finding a sensible way forward, and just hope that now happens elsewhere, and that the government start to actually speak to some of our other colleagues who are fighting for an increase in their pay. In terms of the firefighters' charity, in 2022 alone, Nottinghamshire Fire and Rescue Service raised over £111,000 for the firefighters' charity. The funds were raised from a variety of fundraising events at our stations, volunteering at the Theatre Royal Collections and at the Goose Fair, and the climb of Mount Tootbold by a team of female firefighters. And I got beamed a picture actually while they were at the top of the mountain, which raised over £12,000. A donation of £1,000 by our former Chief Fire Officer John Buckley was used to purchase merchandise which was sold in return for donations at the charity events. And I'd just like to put on record, and I'm sure I speak for the whole authority, a huge thanks to colleagues who are raising funds for the firefighters charity. They've done a fantastic job, as they do every single year. Just in relation to HMI Service Liaison Lead, we have our new HMI Service Liaison Lead. They visited the service on Tuesday the 7th of February as we gear up for our next inspection, which is anticipated to take place after the summer. He met with the strategic leadership team and our team leading our work on the next inspection. He was briefed on service delivery activities and an overview of the Futures 25 and the fire cover review, which we'll talk about in today's agenda. And they left with a really useful insight into Nottinghamshire Fire and Rescue Service, and will continue to be updated on current affairs within the service and on an ongoing basis right up until our inspection. Clearly, we are not resting on our laurels. Huge progress was made from the first inspection we had, where we certainly needed to make improvements, and I think it was great to see good reflected right across all of those different themes. And I want to put on record my thanks to the entire team for that result that we got, and let's hope we get a good result in terms of the next inspection as well. And just two final things. Recent serious incidents since the last Fire Authority meeting, serious fires that our firefighters have attended, including ones in Mansfield and Sutton in Ashfield. A woman in her 50s and a man in his 80s were lost, unfortunately, in terms of those incidents. We've engaged with the affected communities following these tragic incidents and supported the welfare of those firefighters who attended. And I'd just finally like to say that this is our last full Fire Authority meeting before the annual general meeting, which will take place subsequent to the local elections at the start of May. I would just like to thank everybody who has taken part over the last term and indeed the last year on the Fire Authority. There have been challenges. It's not always been easy. There have been some difficult debates in here and disagreements, but they've always been done in good faith, wherever people come from, whatever political party they come from, or whichever community they represent. And I'm certainly very grateful for that as chair. And I just want to put on specific record a thank you to those who are not standing in the local elections, not just for the service they've given to Nottinghamshire Fire and Rescue Authority, but the service they've given to local government as well. I certainly know, Councillor Trimble, you've given the best part of 30 years service to the City of Nottingham, and you've been a fine public servant on here in the authority, and a huge thank you to you, David. And I know
29 and a half.
29 and a half. And I know you'll be thanked appropriately at the City, and also likewise, Nicola, I think we were elected at the same time, you know, done an absolutely fantastic job. Mike, I know you're not standing down from the county, but I think I'm reliably informed you're not really standing for the district.
I'm not intending.
Not intending to, but you know, you've done a fantastic job for Bassett Law, Mike, and I know hopefully you'll still stay with us on the authority. So just
1982 I was first elected.
stint of good service, that, isn't it? So thank you to John.
Yeah, thanks, Chairman. Just a comment on the sad loss of the fire officer. I just wondered if we could have one of the future seminars, some breakdown of what happened at that. I was in Edinburgh on a Saturday, walked past that building, and I thought that's ripe for a fire. And I've worked in construction all my life, and I'm just trying to, if we could get some feedback and to try and start something nationally, so that our fire officers, professionals sat at the back, the boss in front, we can start lobbying a bit to give them a bit more clout. When you see these, it was like a bonfire ready to be lit, and unfortunately in this case we've lost a good fire officer. So it would be interesting to see some feedback. Obviously things have got to settle, we've got to have an inquiry and all the things, and obviously the awful thing is the family's got to deal with it. But it needs raising now. Some of these sites are an absolute disaster. The way the gas cans, the way this one was piled up. It was an old drapery store. It was a big one on Princess Street, but it was the windows were full of wood. It was just chucked any old thing. So it would have been hazardous for somebody to fight that fire. So I'm just asking that if we could have that, Craig, at some future seminar, so that we, all our collective people in different political positions, can start lobbying somebody to say, come on, give these guys and girls some power to go in on site and say, this is wrong, you need to correct that, because health and safety is strong in many places, but I don't feel it's strong in fire when it comes to what you can do as a professional fire officer. Just a comment.
Thank you, John. That's noted, and Chief Fire Officer's taken a note, and I know there'll be obviously an ongoing investigation and inspection in terms of the incident, and I'm sure the Chief Fire Officer's more than happy at the appropriate point to give a brief to elected members and anybody else who's interested, because I think you're right, John, lessons learned, and where there can be further power given to take on some of these derelict buildings that are a huge risk, clearly significant. So I'll leave that. A note's been made by the Chief Fire Officer, and I'm sure he'll come back at an appropriate point. Thank you, John. That's the end of Chair's announcements, so we'll move on to the first substantive item on our agenda, which is Treasury Management Strategy 2023-24, and this is going to be introduced by our Head of Finance and Treasurer, Becky.
Thanks very much. Setting the Treasury Management Strategy is a statutory requirement before the start of the next financial year. So this report sets out a clear framework within which my staff will operate to deliver the Treasury Management function, which is managing all the borrowing and lending and investments and cash flow of the organisation. It's been updated slightly following the SIP Treasury Management revised code of practice, which came out in December 21. There are a couple of changes I will run through with you as we run through. So one of the areas that I know members will be interested in will be the environmental, social and governance policy that was raised last year when we set the Treasury Management strategy. Some ethical investments and how we approached our ethical investments. This has had quite a lot of additional scrutiny from SIPFA, and attached to this strategy is a new ESG, environmental, social and governance policy, which is on page 30 of your pack. So in short, it adds it reflects on the difficulty that you may have in putting cash deposits down on measuring your ESG criteria. It might be a bit more, you can imagine if you're investing in, say, stocks and shares, it's easier to see when you're investing in more ethical investments. But when we're making short-term cash deposits, it's more difficult to know. You're just placing the money basically with usually the banks or other local authorities. The ESG principles are incorporated into the credit ratings that we use to identify where we place our funding. They will always that provide us a rounded approach to make sure that we look after to make sure that we consider the safety of our investments first priority, because clearly we're looking after taxpayers, we're custodians of taxpayers' money until we need to spend it. So looking after the security of our funding and making sure that we have adequate cash flows, and also the amount of interest that we might get. But in that order is the way we prioritise, and ESG will form part of that, but those three will always take priority. So 1.6 has got some other areas where we need to adopt clauses into our financial regulations, and this will be done when we review our financial regulations at Finance and Resources Committee this year. So they will all be adopted there. So in terms of the rest of the strategy, it's largely in line with the strategy that you've seen in previous years. There's no major changes. So on that, I'd just throw open to any questions if anybody wants to ask anything.
Thank you very much, Becky. Any comments or questions to Becky? Councillor Bailey?
Yeah, just more of a comment. As you mentioned, it's not really any different from previous years.
No.
I do know it mentions the fact we need to do a medium-term borrowing for the capital expenditure. So it's just about making sure we're very careful in when we're doing it.
Yeah, so you're borrowing, we take the borrowing, we review what we need, how much we need to borrow in reflection for the capital programme. We look at interest rates. We're allowed to borrow in advance of the financial year if we think it's advantageous to do so, and we have done that previously when we've borrowed when interest rates we're expecting them to increase. We will take the borrowing out earlier, so we take those into consideration as well. And we've set criteria out in the Prudential Code, which is following this report and the next item on the agenda, which will demonstrate how we move from the capital programme to developing the limits for borrowing within the year.
Thank you, Becky. Any other comments or questions? I mean, there's a stark salutary reminder in here, isn't there? We're about to make a decision about the budget, and I've seen news this week of people crowing about the fact that inflation's coming down. I don't think there's any time to crow at the moment. Inflation is still north of 10%, and it's clearly having a significant impact on the service, but actually not only having a significant impact on the service, it's having a significant impact on the cost of living for the people who work for our service, which obviously is reflected in terms of the pay award. And unless until that comes down significantly, and whilst overall inflation might just be north of 10% at the moment, food inflation is still, north of 16%, which is massively hitting people in terms of the weekly shop, and clearly utility prices are having a huge impact on the services budget as well, and that's set out in this report, which is significantly worrying. And if it doesn't turn around, we're going to have significant budget pressure facing us next year as a service as well. Okay, I'll move the recommendations, which are on page 3. It's recommended that members approve the Treasury Management Strategy for 2023-24, the policy on environmental, social and governance considerations, and thank you to Councillor Hollis for raising that in previous years, and to Becky for the work that she's done on that, and that the minimum revenue, we also approved the minimum revenue provision policy for 2023-24. Move the recommendations. Somebody happy to second them? They're seconded. Are they agreed, colleagues? Agreed. Thank you very much. Item 6 then is the Prudential Code for Capital Finance 2023-24. And this is going to be introduced by our Head of Finance and Treasurer, Becky.
Thank you, Chair. So this report is clearly closely linked to the Treasury Management Strategy. The purpose is to demonstrate the affordability of the capital programme proposed as part of the budget report, so you can review this before you set the budget in the next report. So the objective is to ensure that the capital plans are affordable, that the borrowing levels are prudent and sustainable, and that risks associated with those investments are proportionate to the financial capacity of the authority. So it's safeguarding the authority from unwise borrowing and investment decisions, I suppose. So there are a number of indicators included in the report that support your decision making and our decision making. Most of them are in line with what you've seen in previous years. You've got the capital programme, you've got some borrowing and lending criteria, you've got the borrowing maximum amounts, the estimates, the capital finance requirement in 2.9 and the boundaries in 2.15. which are the maximum that we would be permitted to borrow without bringing any decisions back through Fire Authority. There is one additional indicator. If I can turn you to page 42 at 2.38, this is a new benchmark which is included in the SIP for guidance, and it's a liability benchmark which looks at the borrowing and compared to the life of the assets that we are funding from that borrowing. So you'll see the borrowing is in the bars in the graph on page 43, and then the lines are the life of the assets. So and it shows that we're roughly in line. We've got a bit higher borrowing towards the end of that curve, and some of that is because we've borrowed slightly in advance of need because of interest rates. So this is a new indicator and we'll continue to monitor it. But other than that, I think you'll be familiar with all the other indicators that are included in here, and they are all summarised on page 45 in section 10. So if there's any questions or anybody would like me to explain any of them in any more detail, then I'm more than willing to expand.
Thank you, Becky. Any comments or questions? Councillor Quigley.
Well, it's more of a comment. I think that just because we've got a borrowing limit, we should borrow it. And what I'd like to ask is that are we ensuring that we are sweating our assets and bringing in the capital receipts that we expect, rather than taking the easy way out and borrowing the money?
We do have very, very little scope for drawing in capital receipts. Virtually all of the buildings that we own are operational. We do have one building that's just been reviewed that we lease out in Carlton.
Clifton.
Yeah, Clifton. But other than that, when we undertook a review which went before Finance and Resources Committee on that building. But all the other buildings we own are operational, and we do always, when we have big decisions to make, we do look at what's the best function for that and whether we can provide services in a different way. So I think the limited number of buildings that we have and assets that we have does limit the amount of capital receipts that we can get in. We do review the life of the assets that we hold. We have a comprehensive repair and maintenance programme on all our buildings to extend the life as far as possible on buildings and vehicles. For example, we've undertaken a review and we have extended that in the past and then brought it back slightly because the vehicles were giving us a lot of maintenance issues, but it's something that we do actively consider. You'll see from the capital programme this year that there's a lot of vehicle expenditure. It is something that it's a high area of high spend, so it is something we look at very carefully.
Thank you, Councillor Quigley. Thank you, Becky. Any other comments or questions? No? Anything else, Becky? Or are you happy to move to the recommendations yet? So the recommendation is that members approve the prudential limits for 2023-24, which are set out in section 10 of the report that Becky's just spoken to. I'll move. Somebody happy to second the recommendation? Are those agreed? Recommendations agreed, colleagues? Thank you very much. Item 7 then is budget proposals for 2023-24 through to 26-27 and options for council tax 2023 to 2024. And this report's going to be introduced by our Treasurer and Head of Finance. It's a hat trick, Becky.
I'm conscious of the time that we'll probably need to break in a few minutes, but I'll start, and then if you can stop me at the appropriate time, I'd be grateful. So this report, the main purpose of the report is to determine the level of council tax for 23-24. You'll be familiar with the medium-term financial strategy that came before this committee in December and went further to Finance and Resources Committee for further scrutiny and recommendations back to this authority in January. This figures in this report have been updated since the January report. We've had the final funding announcements from the government, which were largely in line with what we expected. We had a small increase in grant of 17,000, but other than that, they were the same. We've had the information from billing authorities regarding council tax and business rates collection. Council tax was largely in line with what we expected, but we did gain quite significantly from growth within the county and also the revaluation of businesses. So just on the collection of income from business rates within the county, we gained an extra £430,000, so it was quite significant. So I think we need to be mindful that has come from businesses, and businesses are paying additional funds, but it has made a welcome contribution to the funding for the authority. When I brought the Finance and Resources Committee report in January, we were expecting a deficit in the region of £529,000, so that 430,000 additional income has brought us very close to a break-even point. But clearly, since then, we've had the revised pay offer as well, which the 7% this year and the 5% for next year, which has increased costs by in the region of £1 million. So that's, we've nearly got to balanced budget, so we've got increased expenditure there. But what I have been able to do is, because we're unlikely now to be drawing back on the number of full-time firefighters that we employ. This year, you'll remember, we've been underspending quite significantly because we've been holding under-established positions. So we've had several firefighter posts under-established by a significant number. We have 2 recruitment courses set for next financial year, one in April and one in September. That is still going to leave us slightly short on the establishment. So I've taken out some of those posts to allow us until we get up to full establishment again, which has brought costs down by about £500,000. So that's the basis where the figures have changed since the January report. It's been a story the whole year, really. But, every time I set something, everything's changing quite quickly. So if I just look at running through the report in order, on the capital programme on page 52, it's the same capital programme that was presented to Finance and Resources, with the exception of the slippage that was approved at Finance and Resources, which has been added to the programme. It largely relates to the transport programme to allow for slippage because of the extended delivery times of the fire appliances mostly. So that's the only difference on there. But with regards to the economy, inflation, as you're already aware, has dropped slightly off to 10.1% now and is looking to drop further in the spring. And the economy did narrowly avoid a recession in December, where we stood still. So with regards to the pay award, I've covered that already. I think most of the other sections are similar to what you've seen previously. Reserves. So moving on to page 58 on the reserves, just to remind members, that we do have a £1.126 million reserve set aside for budget support over the coming years to help us deal with some of the pressures that we have identified. The general fund is currently 5.2 million. I'm expecting some additional expenditure this year as a result of the pay award, which now needs to feed into the budget monitoring position. So it's likely that we will need to take some money out of reserves to cover that out of the general fund reserves. So that will be lower than I've previously reported when we have the final budget monitoring reports at the end of the year. So I think I've covered most of the financing budget. So if onto page 59, I've put together figures for consideration for you today. There are a number of assumptions that I'd like to draw your attention through before we go through them. First one is...
You've got about a minute, Becky.
Okay, I'll cover this quickly and then we'll leave...
You can come back, Becky, after we've
Yeah,
updated.
okay. So firefighter pay award is the 7% as previously discussed. And I've assumed a 5% pay award for all staff for 23-24. Obviously, if the pay award is rejected and it goes up, there'll be additional pressures on the budget. Revenue support grant, I have assumed, will increase in line with predicted inflation for 24-25. So I think that's probably a good place for me to leave it before I move on, if that's
Right on cue.
good.
We've got about half a minute, colleagues, and then we'll stand for a minute's silence. Okay, colleagues, we'll stand to join in the National Minute's silence to show our solidarity and support for Ukraine, but also to remember those who have lost their lives in the awful war that is still ongoing there. Thank you very much, everybody. Carry on, Becky.
Thank you. Right. So I've set out three different levels of council tax for you to consider. So in 2.57, I have also assumed it's been quite difficult to predict future years funding because of the one-year funding settlement. So future years are our best estimate at this point, but it's clear this year how much things have changed over the year, how difficult it does make it to predict future years budgets. So in table 3 looks at what would happen if we left the council tax at current levels, at freezing council tax, and it shows in table 3 that we'd be in excess of 2 million in deficit for 23-24 rising to nearly 6 million in 26-27. So clearly that's an option that would put us in severe financial difficulty if members were to select that. Deficit of 2.95%, which is the level that we thought we would get prior to the government announcing a £5 award. They set out in table 4 on page 61, shows that the deficit for 23-24 would still remain at £1.2 million, which is in excess of the 1.126 million that we have in reserves that to cover the budget deficit. So that would still leave us in a significant financial difficulty. We would still have to make further savings in 23-24, and clearly 24-25 would leave us needing to make in excess of £2 million on current projections. So moving over to page 62, table 5 shows the position with a £5 increase in council tax. Which shows after making the adjustments that I mentioned earlier to the budget would leave us with a £400,000 deficit for 23-24. This can be met from within the £1.126 million that we've got set aside for budget support, but there would be insufficient funding left in that reserve to cover the full costs that we're expecting in 24-25 of £1.1 million. So it does allow us to set a balanced budget using those reserves for next year, but it does still leave the authority with a significant amount of work in future years for us to balance the budget, which is something we need to continue to work on and consider moving forward. So I've put a summary of the position in table 6. It shows the 3 positions, those bottom 3 lines in there. So the £5 increase in council tax does raise the authority an additional 1.6 million, which has been essential in order for us to balance the budget for 24-25, without which we'd be clearly up near a £2 million deficit. So the earmark reserve in 2.68 will cover the deficit, but would not be able to cover the deficit should a 2.95% increase in council tax be approved. We will make further efforts to try and balance the budget and minimise the amount that we need to use from reserves in the year. The establishment level will be kept under review, and if maybe there may be a small amount of further savings that may be available in there. And also we'll be monitoring expenditure with caution and trying to identify further savings where we can throughout the year. So the level of savings required will still need to be considered in future years as part of the funding settlements and part of the budget settlements for next year. So my recommendation and the recommendation of the Finance and Resources Committee back to the Fire Authority is that there be that members approve a £5 increase in council tax. So table 6 on page 64 shows what the impact of a £5 increase in council tax would be. You'll see band D would raise from £84.57 to £89.57. The £5 across the year would be just less than 10 pence per week for those that are on a band D. Band A would proportionately increase by slightly less and would be increasing by £3.33, which is about 6.5p a week. There are 2 other recommendations on the report regarding the fees and charges, which increase in line with inflation. They are set out in Appendix D. So some of them increase with pay inflation in line with the pay award, where the cost is predominantly based on the cost of sending a person to undertake a task, or otherwise it's just CPI inflation. And then the approval of the continuation of members' allowances in line with the current policies. So you'll see that on page 65, comments of the Treasurer, I need to make a statement on the robustness of the estimates made for the purpose of the calculation and the adequacy of reserves, and I feel able to do that should a £5 increase in council tax be approved. I think that the adequacy of reserves will be sufficient to enable the authority to set a balanced budget in 23-24. So if anybody's got any questions.
Thank you very much, Becky. And just before I throw it open to questions, I'd put on record, I said this at the Finance and Resources Committee, a personal thank you to you, Becky, because I think undoubtedly, certainly in my time on the Fire Authority, this has been the most difficult year to land a budget because of some of the unpredictability and unknowns that you've set out, but because of the situation the country finds itself in as well. What is obviously not gone away here in any of this budget, I support fully the recommendations, and I'm urging people in the room, cross-party, unanimously as we had last year, to support the recommendation that the Finance and Resources Committee, as we discharged them to do, recommended to full authority, which is to increase council tax by the £5 maximum, which is 7 pence per week for a Band B property, given that most properties in Nottinghamshire and the City of Nottingham are Band A and Band B, but is 10 pence a week for a Band D property. I think it would be very remiss of this Fire Authority to have lobbied so hard for flexibility in council tax to the government to then not make use of that full flexibility. I absolutely understand the pressure that is on families, the cost of living crisis, and asking people even to contribute an additional 10 pence per week or 7 pence per week is probably asking too much. But I do fundamentally believe in the conversations I have with people week in, week out on the doorsteps that the people have trust in and support the fire service and are willing to make a smaller contribution to make sure that we protect our frontline services, which is clearly what is trying to be landed here in terms of certainly next year's budget. The medium-term financial plan clearly still has significant pressure on it. Any organisation at the moment in the country that's in the public sector has significant pressure on it in terms of the medium-term financial strategy. And the point I'll just make here is most medium-term financial strategies in councils, in the police, in the fire service, in most public organisations at the moment are best guesstimates by colleagues in finance departments, because we only get a one-year settlement from government. And I think the next lobbying job of all of us collectively is to get a multi-year settlement for the fire sector. It cannot be right that we ask public sector organisations, and particularly emergency services, to plan year to year, hand to mouth in terms of service delivery. You wouldn't run a household budget like that. You wouldn't want to run a private business like that. The central government doesn't run its budget like that. We need to secure that multi-year settlement that was promised. But what also hasn't gone away here in terms of the budget, notwithstanding hopefully unanimous agreement around the council tax, which eases the pressure next year, is that we are still, and I said this before, it's a statement of fact this is, I'm not making a partisan point here, but it is a frustration of mine. We are still the 7th worst affected fire and rescue service in the country in terms of our reduction in core spending power, i.e. the money available for us to spend on our service to support the residents of the City of Nottingham, Nottinghamshire, since 2010-2011. And there is still a fundamental question for me, and I have raised this with ministers, and ministers have accepted that this is the case, but it hasn't changed. We've lost 5.26% of our core spending power since 2010-2011 in Nottinghamshire. At the same time, Hampshire Fire and Rescue Service have seen a 14.95% increase. Bedfordshire have seen a 13.64% increase, and there's been an 11.92% increase in Shropshire. And if I was a resident, as I am, and a taxpayer in the City of Nottingham and Nottinghamshire, I would be asking the question, how is it right that we've seen a significant reduction in funding in Nottinghamshire, but other places have seen an increase in funding? And that disparity, in my view, has got to be closed by central government. Whichever party is in power after the next general election has got to get to grips with that issue, because if they don't, the pressure will continue in the medium-term financial plan. And I'd just go back to the point I made about inflation earlier. Official figures set out by the government themselves show that there's about £145 million worth of inflationary pressure on the fire sector at the moment. Clearly, we are one part of that, one service within that cog. Hardly any of that has been funded in the funding settlement by government, and there is a frustration. Caroline faces this in the police, we face it in other areas. any slight increase in core spending power we had this year in the service is predicated on us taking the maximum council tax. It's not additional monies from the Treasury, it's money that is going to have to come out of the pockets of residents in the city. We got a tiny amount of additional money, but it was very tiny. You heard Becky talk about it in the report, and I'm not churlish about that. We're very grateful for that tiny amount of additional money, but essentially we are balancing the budget here on the pockets of residents in Nottingham and Nottinghamshire. I would urge colleagues to unanimously support the £5 increase in council tax, which, as I say, is 10p a week, band D, 7 pence per week, band B, but would just stress the point that the lobbying does not stop here. We have to make sure that next year either there is an uplift in the referendum limit on council tax, but also there is a significant uplift in terms of revenue support grant funding or other funding from central government, because it's spelt out clearly in here to us from Becky. There is a red warning light flashing on the dash that says we have a £1.3 million deficit next year. You know, and there was hard work between the start of the consultation on the fire service cover review, you know, and I'm very, very grateful for everybody who took part in that. All parties, you know, and on the work that was done, the Fire Brigades Union, the Chief Fire Officer, you know, put his neck on the line and came and spoke at a rally in Parliament, and all the people who've been having private conversations with ministers. I'm very, very grateful, but, you know, I would call this a reprieve. That's all we've succeeded in getting here is a reprieve, and the lobbying and the campaigning has got to continue. So I would urge colleagues to get behind this recommendation that's set out in the report and that has been recommended by the Finance and Resources Committee. Councillor Lee.
Chairman, thank you. This comment gets made a lot, and I have to address it, is when we say we have to raise council tax because the money hasn't come from national government and the money is coming from the pockets of our residents. The money comes from the pockets of our residents, no matter who pays it. It's national government or local government. It still comes from mine and your pocket and Mr Smith's down the road. The government don't make their own money. We don't make our own money. Any money that is spent from national government or by us is still from the pockets of our residents. And that has to be made clear. The government do not have a magic money tree. We do not have a magic money tree. Any money comes from me, you and our residents. And it's misleading to say otherwise. Thank you, Chairman.
Thanks, Councillor Lee. I mean, you make a self-evident point. The point I just made to you is politics is also about choices, and the central government has a choice about where it distributes the money that it takes in taxation. And they have chosen, unfortunately in my view, not to invest in the fire and rescue service in the way they should here in Nottinghamshire. And I'm not going to make any apologies for continuing to argue for our service vociferously to make sure that it gets the investment that it deserves. And by the way, I'd be doing that if it were a Labour government. I'd be doing it if it was a coalition government, because actually it is a service we all in this room rely on. When you ring 999, you want to know that people are there to support you and respond in the same way that, you know, Caroline has argued with her own colleagues in government. Sometimes you have to do that. You have to make the case. That's your responsibility that we're discharged with around this room. So I accept it's all taxation, Councillor Lee. That's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is there's a disparity in the way Nottinghamshire Fire and Rescue Service is funded in comparison to other services. And the point I'm making is we can argue in here until the cows come home about whether we agree, disagree or this about central government. There's a fact in front of us. There's a £1.3 million deficit in front of us next year. We are legally discharged to set a balanced budget, and we will not be able to do that without making frontline service cuts unless there is some additional investment. And there ain't, you know, there might not be a magic money tree. There ain't additional income streams for the fire and rescue service. There's council tax, there's business rates, which Becky's alluded to, and there's central government funding. There isn't really anywhere else. We don't charge particularly for services. They are the only streams. So unless there is a different model for the way we fund our emergency services in this country, they're the only streams. And in my view, we've got to go out there and argue for them. And, you know, I haven't heard anybody yet explain to me how it is right that we've lost 5% over the last decade in our funding in Nottinghamshire, but Hampshire's seen an uplift in 14.65% in the funding. And that's a statement of fact. That's not me spinning figures. That's there on the government's own website in black and white, and I am still yet to hear an answer about how that can be right for our residents. And I'm going to continue to make that case, because if we don't make that case, we're not going to get a response, are we? We made the case this year around the council tax and we won that argument. You know, that was a significant win. I'm not churlish about it, but I'm not going to make any apologies, Councillor Lee, for continuing to make that case. I will continue to make it vociferously. Anybody else got any comments or questions? Councillor Hollis, then
Yeah.
Councillor Wheeler, and then Councillor Rain.
Yeah, just to come back on that, I mean, obviously, John, I respect your viewpoint, but ultimately, national taxation is a lot fairer and more evenly distributed than local taxation. You know, if you live in a band A, B, C or D property, which most people in Ashfield do, of course most A and B, the local taxation does hit you a lot harder. So yeah, I acknowledge the point that tax is tax, but you know, big businesses and various other things are paying into national taxation, we're saying it's evenly distributed. Whereas local taxation, like I say, does hit people on the ground a lot harder, and that's what my concern is. But then I think the second point we need to make is, you know, Michael maybe won't play the politics a little bit, but if you look at the documents about the Public Works Bond loan interest, which of course are adding to our bills, why has that gone up significantly? Possibly something to do with the Conservative or Liz Truss's particularly mini budget, and that's the reason why we're having to pay more day-to-day costs. So as much as we do have choices, those choices are made, and that's here our day-to-day costs as well. And one of the reasons, you know, I'll be supporting this today is because ultimately I can go back to Huthwaite and I can go back to Ashfield and Nottinghamshire wider and say you're paying that extra few quid, but what we're getting for it. And if you look at Ashfield's budget, you know, we can talk to things like the spring clean, we can talk to things like you know, new leisure centres, various things like that. At the fire authority, I can look people in the eye and say, Ashfield Fire Station's getting back to what it used to be because of this decision. Coverage across Nottinghamshire is going to be fairer because of this decision. And that's what I'm going to go back, and that's why I'll be amply supporting the budget today. Whereas I think, frankly, maybe on the left-hand side, you should look yourselves in the mirror and say, the £300 increase that the county council's raised council tax over the last 5 years, what are people getting it? There's just more swimming pools in the roads with the potholes. That's about the only thing I can see. And that's probably what I'd say, as politely as I possibly can. But I can see what the residents of Nottinghamshire and Nottingham City are going to be getting for this extra increase. And that's on top of course, the extra safety and frankly supporting the good men and women that actually work for the service here and paying them fairly and making sure the whole service runs smoothly. And that's why I think both Jason and I do support what's in this budget, as much as it is a tough time, exactly Councillor Payne says, this time of year to ask people to pay more, but I think at least people can see what they're getting for it, and I think that's ultimately the fundamental difference between this authority and others.
Thank you, Councillor Hollis. Councillor Wheeler.
Thank you. I mean, I join the thanks to Becky and the finance team for the work you've done. I know from my years gone past, the same budget on a much smaller scale, the headaches I had, so I imagine the one you've had with this one. I mean, you know, we on this side obviously are going to support the £5 increase, as much as, you know, goes against the, I'm saying, a lot of philosophy in terms of balance tax. I think, and I agree with many points Councillor Hollis made. One point he made about we can actually justify to residents why we're doing it. I think that's the key point. And actually, if you look at when we further on the agenda where we have the fire cover response review, actually the response from residents actually, I think, shows that they are in agreement. I think 80% of residents, and that's across every district, the majority of people saying they support it. So I think that shows the reputation we have as an authority. And you know, I'm more than happy to work with yourself, Michael, and patients, and to look at how we can speak to government and look at the funding going forward. Because I think we need to. I do agree in terms of looking to make the case for the multi-assessment, and as long as we can justify in this room why we need that extra money and that we are doing everything we can. So it's still important we don't just sit on our laurels, we keep reviewing all our assets, as Mike's talked about earlier. We look at all our assets, we look at everything to make sure we can sit there in that room with government and say, we've done everything we can on our end, this is what we need from you. And I think that will be the key driver going forward.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, I agree with that, Councillor Wheeler, and I think, you know, I'm not frightened for us to go and have that conversation with the Minister. We've taken £9.6 million out of the budget in the last few years. You well know that. That's not been easy for anybody who works for the service. So I won't have anybody tell us that we haven't taken efficiencies out and we haven't taken tough decisions. We have, and we should proudly go and make that case. You know, where we found there have been inefficiencies in the budget, we've stripped them out to the tune of £9.6 million. That's had a direct impact, though, on the service. But I welcome your support for lobbying. I do think there is a job of work, and I made this point before, to make sure that we get our members of Parliament hunting as a pack on this. We can't, again, have another lobby of Parliament where we have MPs who don't turn up. to the lobby of Parliament. It's not acceptable. We need all our MPs, whatever party they're from, to be down there arguing and making the case, because they've got direct access to ministers. We can write, we can make the case, we can make the argument. Caroline can support us in the conversation she's having, which I know she's done in the background as well. But we do need our MPs to hunt as a pack on this issue and to really put the pressure on in the lead up to next year's funding settlement. And they were all briefed. We've made sure they've been given the argument and given the facts and figures. Councillor Ray.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Becky, for the report. I think it's thorough. Like you saying, Chair, it's been a stressful year, I think, for a lot of people on this authority. We've nearly had to do things that, we talked about doing things that are extremely, unwelcome. None of us, I think, wanted to do. Becky's done a lot of tough work in terms of it. We're in a very bad situation economically in terms of, how inflation's affecting us and so on. And the finances do feel a bit precarious. We seem to sit here every year and we just about get through it, and it's due to the tenacity, the lobbying of our staff colleagues, the trade unions, ourselves, and then the work and efficiencies that we've made that we can actually do this. But I mean, I'll say it and I'll say it again for the record because people are watching this. Council tax is something I don't agree with. It's a deeply regressive and unfair tax. As already been pointed out, 80% in the city of Nottingham that I represent are A and B properties. People are struggling. It's no basis to fund services. And it's not just us, is it? It's other services. It's social care, vulnerable adults, etc. We're sat in meetings and it's horrific in terms of public services at the moment. I know what Tom's saying about the potholes. We've got them all over because the way that's been funded has favoured certain counties. And to be honest, it's interesting what Councillor Lee says, because we hear this all the time, that it comes from the public tax. It does. The problem is it comes from the wrong section of the public. At the moment, the burden of taxation over the last 20 years has fallen massively on people who actually go out and do the right thing and work. Unearned income in this country, from the Prime Minister's wife downwards, and a lot of donors to the Conservative Party, is rarely taxed. It's not taxed to the percentage that most of our workforce are paying. So there is a choice not to do that. It is a political point. We do need to make it, but we do need to say that we do feel, like Councillor Hollis was saying, that when you put a council tax up, it's not an easy thing to do. I have to represent a lot of people who are just about managing, who struggle with their bills as it is, and I'm sure that's the case elsewhere. And there is a magic money tree. There's a magic money tree on levelling up funding. I'm glad our colleagues in Ashfield got some money, but that's because they've got a Conservative MP, and it's the same everywhere. It's like running a banana republic. When they want the money, they find the money for it if it's to buy votes, but if it's to fund public services or fund our staff to the pay they deserve, they don't find it. So it is a political point, but we need to get political because, quite frankly, it's not good sitting around saying, oh, well, if only they could do better. We need to tell them that our residents deserve better and that the services should be funded properly and for the long term. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Ray. Councillor Clark.
Yeah, thanks, Chairman. I obviously agree with the recommendation and place my thanks to Becky and the teams that have put that together, and to yourself for going round to, you've met every MP, which takes time and it's difficult gathering those together. I don't agree with the bit on council tax. You'll go out, you'll go buy a cup of coffee today, or you'll go and buy a pint of ale. It'll be more than what we're wanting to charge. We will reduce the safety of our people, the people that are working hard for us and putting their lives on the line every single day. And for £5, I don't think there's anybody. You can stop the first dozen, 2 dozen or 200 people out there and ask them, do you think this is a fair deal? And I think you'll find that they'll say, it is a fair deal. You're trying to keep the quality there, because if we reduce it, we will then introduce things, shortages, things that are trying to cut it, and if we cut it, we'll cut the quality down, and I worry about that. I also think the authority ought to pay recognition to the FBU for the way they've not gone out there. We've normally before we'd have big bonfires outside fire stations, people waving all sorts of banners, all sorts of people coming in, having a shout at it. It's been negotiated, and it must have been, it takes some good doing to get it through, because you look at some of the prices today, and I was saying to some of my colleagues earlier, I think the BBC's shopping basket today has gone up £67 over the last year. That's significant. That's a rise. Every week. This is not over a year, and I think we've got good value. But I think the way the FBU did it, the way that other unions are doing the negotiation now, they're recognising there's a problem. We've only got a finite amount of money, but we've got to keep these services going. I'd like to see hopefully it'll be Jason will be next MP for Ashfield. At least we'll get somebody in there having a shout. Not the one who says you can live on, is it 30p a day, Jason?
Yeah.
Something like that, some ridiculous figures like that. Have a look at these accounts, you'll see where they're going, and you see there is a problem next year. And I think as urgently as we can start looking at it, how are we going to deal with that? How are we going to deal with it? If they won't give us a 3-year settlement, we've got to look what the 3-year settlement looks like. It's laid out on page, whatever it is, 60-something there, of what the pathway is, and it's not good. And we've got to defend the people that work for us, their rights, their families and everything else. Actually, we'll have more and more problems coming in. So support the recommendation, and thank you, Becky.
Thank you, Councillor Clark, and thank you for your work as well as Chair of the Finance and Resources Committee. Very much appreciated. Councillor Battlemarch?
Yeah, just very briefly, because I supported this at the Finance Committee. I just think it's worth looking at the, I know we're going to discuss it later, but the consultation we did, and on page 119 of the pack, page 34 of the consultation, there was a specific question: do you support a one-off £5 council tax increase for the Fire and Rescue Service? 80% said yes to either strongly support or support, and 8% strongly opposed and 5% opposed. So, you know, when we asked the question of the public, that was the response we got, and I'd be very happy with that sort of polling of 80%, to be honest. Now, you know, there's an argument about how many people respond to consultations, and we shouldn't be complacent. We should do a lot more. But you know, I'm pleased that those of us who were concerned about this went out and really tried to engage with the public on it over the past 3 months, and we got a very good response. So I think it speaks for itself when you look at those figures.
Thank you, Councillor Battlemarch. Any other comments or questions?
Would you mind if I come back, Chairman?
Of course, yeah.
With all due respect, Ashfield were only complaining that they hadn't received much money from national government. I think it's the first portion that you got there, and Ashfield aren't £50 million in the black hole, unlike the city. I get that the city are struggling at the moment with their finances, but it's not to blame national government because they want money.
You cut us down by £127 million, so don't come to me about funding. That's absolutely ridiculous. You're a clown. Be quiet.
Right.
Chairman, I've not finished. Robin Hood Energy.
No, Councillor Lee. No.
You have no idea what you're talking about.
Colleagues.
Seriously, you're barely literate.
Colleagues.
Mind your neck in.
Colleagues.
How did it go?
Councillor Lee.
Chairman, I think.
No, I've heard, yeah, Councillor Lee. Everybody. I'm asking everybody. Let's calm down and behave like adults. There's an important decision to be taken here. Colleagues who are here observing in the room who rely on the decisions we're about to take in the service, and we need to behave slightly better than we just behaved 2 minutes ago. Right, are there any other comments and questions in relation to the budget proposals? No? This is a legally required recorded vote. Colleagues will be aware of that in terms of the legislation. So if colleagues are happy with this, how I suggest we deal with this is how we've done it previously, that we take the first 2 recommendations, which are to agree the recommendation of the Finance and Resources Committee to the Fire Authority that there be a £5 council tax increase, that's on a Band D property, and that we approve the 2023-24 precept level to be notified to the billing authorities based on the information set out in Section 2 and Appendix C as required by the statute. So I'm going to take those 2 recommendations as a recorded vote in a moment. I'll ask the clerk to do the roll call in terms of the recorded vote, and then I suggest, which is what we've done in previous years, we take the latter 2 recommendations to approve the fees and charges for 2023-24 as set out in Appendix D of the report, and to approve the payment of members' allowances, which is a legal requirement for 2023-24 in accordance with the approved scheme. I would then suggest that we take those just by show of hands together if colleagues are happy. Are colleagues happy that's an appropriate way to deal with these recommendations? Okay, so a named vote in terms of the first 2 recommendations that I've just read out, colleagues. Clark?
Okay, so when I call out your name, could you indicate for, against or abstain, please? Councillor Payne?
4.
Councillor Ifidora?
4.
Councillor Bailey?
4.
Councillor Battlemuch?
4.
Councillor Clark?
4.
Councillor Corden?
4.
Councillor Fielding?
4.
Councillor Heaton? Councillor Hollis?
4.
Councillor Khan?
Yeah, 4.
Councillor Lee?
4.
Councillor Quigley?
4.
Councillor Rain?
4.
Councillor Trimble?
4.
Councillor Upton?
4.
Councillor Wheeler?
4.
Councillor Zadrozny?
4.
And Police and Crime Commissioner Henry?
4.
Thank you. That is unanimous.
That was unanimously agreed, colleagues. Thank you to the clerk and thank you to colleagues. And it does just demonstrate that where you can find common ground, you can agree. And I'm very, very grateful to everybody around the room for the unanimous decision. And let me just reiterate my thanks to Becky and also to the Chief Fire Officer. This has not been an easy report or an easy budget to land, and both of them and the entire team have done a fantastic job. But certainly they've worked very, very closely with me in Patience and Councillor Clark in the last few months, and I'm very, very grateful for it. I'm going to move the recommendations, the final two recommendations that I read out. So I'd be happy to second those recommendations. Our colleagues happy to agree. I'm going to ask, because given this is a budget decision, all those in favour? All those against? Any abstentions? Those were also unanimously agreed. Thank you very much, colleagues. The next item on the agenda then is Futures 2025. The efficiency strategy update, and there are two questions in relation to this report from our colleagues from the Fire Brigade Union. So I'm going to ask them to read out the first question. I'll respond, and then I'll let them read out the second question.
Thank you, Chair. Given the recent vote which just occurred, there's a slight amendment to our first question in the final paragraph. In September's Fire Authority meeting, we asked that will this authority agree to postpone all recommendations currently proposed until after financial budgets have been officially announced by the government? Despite this request and some support, it was denied. Firefighters and members of the public have been put into a position that has caused an enormous amount of stress and anxiety, a situation which was completely avoidable. The proposals contained within the Futures 25 paper were based on estimates and assumptions and not fact. There was another way, which we have now proven to be correct. We thank the members of this authority that stood with the FBU to campaign and lobby for funding and an increase in the council tax precept. We have been clear though, the FBU will continue to lobby. This should be a lesson to all that giving up and accepting what seems inevitable is never the right approach. We deserve more, and so does the public that we strive to protect. The increase in the allowance precept buys us time to consider future options and to continue to work together to secure funding that we require for the future. We commend the Fire Authority for accepting the recommendations of a precept rise to the maximum £5 limit, and we ask that this authority commit to working together in the future to secure funding to protect our service and give assurances that before announcing proposals with such wide-reaching implication in the future, that real consideration is given to the impact on firefighters and the members of our public. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. So the response to the question is the last year, clearly, and a number of members have reflected on this, and you've reflected on this in your question, has been a challenge for everybody involved. And believe me, I well recognise the stress and anxiety that it's caused firefighters and members of staff and members in this room. There hasn't been a single day that's gone by that I haven't thought about the decision and strained every sinew to try and make sure that we land in a position where we didn't have to make these service cuts, and I know there are other colleagues around the room who have been doing the same thing. It is also the reflection, isn't it, on the last decade, you know, as I spoke about earlier, and it's not one that anybody wanted to experience. I didn't come into public service to make cuts. I came into public service to try and improve people's lives, which is exactly the same mission that your trade union has as well. However, I will say that the Futures 25 strategy and the pre-planning approach that we set out has ensured, as demonstrated just in the previous vote, that the Fire Authority has been able to balance its budget, which is a legal requirement. I didn't set those rules. I might not like those rules, but we have to play by those rules, whatever they are the rules. And we had to balance the budget, and we had to have a plan about how we can operate in a sustainable way. On behalf of the Fire Authority, I just want to thank all stakeholders, as I've just said, including the Fire Brigades Union, for the work that was undertaken and the pressure that has been applied, both locally and nationally, to highlight the issues facing Nottinghamshire. And you should particularly take credit for the lobby of Parliament, the joint lobby of Parliament that was held, obviously, during the consultation period. And I agree with Councillor Clark. You've also campaigned in good faith and reasonably. Let me just say this. I sat here a few short months ago and said very, very clearly no decision had been made before the consultation went out. I also said this Fire Authority, while ever I was the chair and leading it, would listen. And I meant what I said. I don't just say things for sound bites, and we listened. And I spent every single day as the chair of this Fire Authority since that decision lobbying. Was it right to delay, and I argued this in the room at the time, and I know other people had different views, was it right to delay the consultation until this meeting? Because this is the next point we would had to make decisions. No, it would have been remiss of me as a chair of the Fire Authority to do that because of a few reasons. At that point, there was no additional flexibility in council tax, and had we got beyond the end of December, the finance settlement landed, I think, a few short days before Christmas Eve. Becky spent the vast majority of her Christmas crunching the figures. Had we not landed an additional flexibility in council tax, and believe me right to the wire, and you know this in the FBU, ministers were still pushing back and saying their recommendation to the Chancellor and Prime Minister was not to give an uplift. We only landed that in the last few days before the settlement. Had we not achieved that, this budget would have still been very, very close to £23 million deficit. I wouldn't have been able to balance a legal budget, and I would have either been asking for job cuts or closes in station, which was something I wasn't willing to countenance. Secondly, Becky's already elucidated in her report that without an increase in business rates retention, which came in at the last minute, we wouldn't have been able to close the financial gap. And finally, we did achieve some uplift in terms of the financial settlement in December as a result of our lobbying, and you should take some credit for that. In essence, Councillor Battlemuch hit the nail on the head about this. I think the public consultation, however stressful it was, however much anxiety it created, and believe me, I had my fair share of anxiety and stress throughout that consultation as well, it did draw attention nationally to the pressure on the fire sector, and particularly to the pressure being faced here in Nottinghamshire. I'm not sure we would have had members of the governing parties, MPs, in business questions and Home Office questions, asking the first question in those questions about Nottinghamshire Fire and Rescue Service had we not consulted on these cuts. I've certainly never heard any of them on their feet arguing for the service. That ended up happening as a result of the consultation. So I know it was very difficult. I didn't want to go out and consult on this. I didn't want to cause stress and anxiety, but it would have been the wrong thing to do to wait until today to see whether those things that we wanted to happen came into fruition. We spent the time throughout the consultation lobbying, and I'm proud where we've ended up, and you should be very proud in the FBU of the work that you conducted throughout the campaign as well. Your second question.
Thank you, Chair. The FBU is disappointed with the recommendation to allow Ashfield Fire Station to remain as a data shift crew model. The FBU has expressed its concerns on multiple occasions to end this crew model on any station, especially one with such a diverse geographical area and level of risk. This authority should be striving to reduce attendance time and improve the level of cover provided to our communities across the whole of Nottinghamshire. Will the Fire Authority make a commitment to explore all available options in order to revert Ashfield back to a 24-hour whole-time station without any further cuts and any detrimental proposals to other station areas?
Thank you for your question, Mark. If you hang fire as well till we get into the report, you'll get a direct response to your question. But for now, I'll just say the report, clearly, members haven't made a decision on this, details that the Chief Fire Officer has already committed to explore viable options to resource to risk. But the extent of this approach will clearly only be achievable within the available financial envelope. The authority continues, as you know, to face a budget deficit regardless of the ability to raise council tax by £5, and we look forward to the advice of the Chief Fire Officer on potential options. I will be crystal clear about this, and I was clear about this a few short months ago. The report was conducted for us by the independent organisation, ORH as it was, clearly identifies a gap in resourcing to risk for the community in Ashfield. And in my view, and in the Chief Fire Officer's view, it's set out in the report crystal clear, that cannot be ignored. And you'll hear a bit more in terms of the introduction of the report from the Chief Fire Officer about that. And if you wait for the decision, hopefully it might address the concerns that you've raised, Mark. But thank you for putting the question the way that you have. Okay, colleagues, thank you to the FBU for both of those questions. I'm going to ask the Chief Fire Officer to introduce the Futures 25 Efficiency Strategy Update report, which is on page 75 in our agenda.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Authority. In terms of your decisions, it adds a bit more context to the report. It says on a number of occasions through the report that depends on the financial ability we have as a service to deliver services. And as the Chair's already said as well, is that we kind of sat here, and I sat here in September saying nobody would be putting their hands up, I think, with the actual words I used for what we were recommending. And clearly on some interviews I gave, this wasn't what you wanted to do as your new Chief Fire Officer coming in as it was at the time. But the reality is that was the picture we had at the time. During 2022, and Becky's clearly highlighted on a number of occasions, we had planning assumptions of 2.2 million in spring last year, rising to 3.3 million deficit during the year. I think it was revised in August, September of last year. So as the chair has sort of said, if we'd have waited to see financial settlement, we'd have sat here today with some real difficulties about how you would have balanced your budget going into the next financial year. And I accept as well that that's caused lots of anxiety, but in the same breath I would thank everybody that's been involved in that alongside myself in terms of whatever my role has been, whether it's staff, whether it's the Fire Brigades Union, members who have lobbied, MPs engagement that we've had, and Becky and the team, the support I've had personally from Becky and her team over these recent months has been absolutely phenomenal, which has got us to the report to today. During the background session of your report, we've articulated there the 9 recommendations. I know that it's very easy to focus just on the one recommendation around the public consultation and the cuts from operational response, but just draw back to the Futures 25 strategy is far broader about how you will scrutinise your service in your authority role. And just going down those, the first 2 in terms of deliver the proposed reduction in non-operational staff, that's been delivered subject to final agreements today during exempt items, and the report clearly details that's £250,000 from non-operational staff that's been saved in this last 12 months. And bearing in mind during 2022 we made temporary savings of £1.6 million in the organisation as well. So the first 2 we've actually done. We went through a period of public consultation, so those first 2 recommendations that you supported thankfully have been delivered. The third one in terms of noting the changes in demand of response resources, that's something that is in progress, and we'll bring those reports back periodically to Community Safety Committee, F&R Committee and Policy Strategy, and through group leaders and this wider authority. Attendance response times is something that we monitor, but in terms of what the future response measures should be, that is something that we've kind of started to look at, but I wouldn't sort of say we've made any real progress in that yet. But that is part of something we do as part of our community risk management planning anyway. Consider the option to pursue a referendum. Members were very clear at last time that was not something that you wanted to support, so clearly that one was delivered because there was no support for it. Support of the view of the commitments in the community risk management plan, that is something that is ongoing, and we do that through monitoring in the strategic leadership team, and those things will be reported back either to Fire Authority or Community Safety Committee, where you can scrutinise and challenge office to make sure we are following the strategy set by the Fire Authority. Endorse limited use of reserves, as Becky's done through the Treasury Management and the budget proposals. That is supported in terms of the limited use of reserves, and that's been clearly set out by Becky about what's left in terms of available to you. Receive further updates. This is one of the updates, and you'll receive more. And investigating sustainable longer-term strategic collaborations, and that's something that we've not made much progress on, but hopefully you'll give us some lenience over that. The last year has been quite challenging in terms of resources to do everything else, but that is actually commencing. So that gives you a bit of a backdrop, really, members, about where we've been. Moving into the report then, and I don't want us to kind of focus too much detail on any one bit. I won't go through in great detail in the appendix around the public consultation. The outcome was what we predicted in September, both in terms of numbers of engagement would be poor, because there's only 1,800 responses that we've had. When you think about that as a point something of a % of our population, how do we get people to engage in that? And that is a perennial problem, I think, not just for this service, but for public sector in general when they're consulting. And it's usually only those people who are directly affected in a geographic area that really mobilise and get involved in it, notwithstanding people like obviously our Fire Brigades Union colleagues who get involved in on a much wider scale. Since the Futures 25, a lot of energy has gone into the work, and I will just as a reflection, I've said there about £1.6 million of savings last year. We had a 30% turnover of our support staff. We moved to joint headquarters, and we were planning for industrial or potential for industrial action. So to get where we've got to today is an absolute credit to the wider team that I have the pleasure of working alongside. We've been able to do some work as well around what it meant around the latest pay offer, and Becky's laid that out. And again, I won't touch on that because obviously members have now let for the £5, which again puts a different context on the paper. In 2.3, however, I will just point out what Becky's input into this about how we are going to balance the budget, and she's already as well said, about keeping vacancies open. This means for the coming months that there is less firefighters than full establishment, and that is part of the way of balancing the budget. Clearly in the table that Becky laid out, it's a £404,000 deficit for the coming financial year, but nearly £500,000 of that isn't shown in that, is firefighter pay, and that is part of balancing the budget. Otherwise it would be nearer a £900,000 deficit for the coming financial year. So regardless of the court's proposals, there is still less firefighters in Nottinghamshire. And I would make the point as well, HMI by their own figures, this authority has got just about 11% reduction since 2016 in firefighter posts, as opposed to a 3% national average. So there is something clearly happening in the ratio of funding and firefighter numbers there. So kind of moving through in terms of page 77, I don't think there's anything, Chair, I want to cover further on that page, but I will move us on to page 78 of the members' packs. There's a statement in there in terms of italics, and this comes from the Fire Minister's letter to chairs of fire authorities, that should you levy £5, there is an expectation of government, and they will come through their audits and HMI to make sure that you are being effective and efficient about how you're using that money. And there's lots of comments about it shouldn't purely be used for firefighter pay. Well, whatever budget we get is used for firefighters' pay. I don't think you can detach one from the other, but there is a clear expectation of government there in the bottom end of that around non-pay efficiencies and productivity efficiencies. And I think further in the report you'll see that productivity is going up in this organisation, and one of the reasons why we are rated as good currently, subject to our next inspection. Halfway down page 78 it talks about workforce review. And again, I would reiterate is that, you know, we have one of our values is one team, and we are so much broader than just our emergency response. If we want to be an outstanding organisation, we have to be good at all that we do, and that includes everybody from finance to prevention, protection and response. And I don't think you can have an outstanding organisation where you have one without the other. The Conservative is continues to on the workforce review. There's £250 million of savings from non-operational workforce that will be in an exempt paper. So that is being delivered as we proposed back in September. So we're delivering on that. One of the things I will say about my own experience that members facilitate is your scheme of delegation to me in consultation with the chair about how we can disestablish, establish and convert posts in the organisation. That has greatly helped in terms of our ability to be a far more agile. It's cut down issues from months to weeks. And that is making sure that we can make sure that balancing budget decisions are far smoother and slicker. And there's probably about a dozen posts where we've been able to demonstrate now that that's actually been the case. So that has been certainly something to feedback to authority. That has been a really useful tool for us to be able to use. So we'll carry on doing that in terms of phase 2. That will continue. Fire cover review on page 79 of your packs. And again, I don't intend to go through every section of this, members. There's an appendix there in great detail. That is published for public availability and scrutiny for people to use and question the authority and the service as the days and months if they wish. But again, that's a good example really about how public consultation can work. Coming down the page, it talks about the 1800 2.13. Again, disappointing 1800 questionnaires over something that is so dear to all our hearts. And there is still somewhere we're not going to be complacent about how do we engage in more about doing that in terms of community engagement, getting the message across, and there's a wider issue. So few people seem to know what the Fire and Rescue Service does. They think it's still about 999 fire and then coming on blue lights and two tones to the incident when actually was so much more than that. So there's clearly some work for the sector to do there. The following pages really just pick out in terms of some of the proposals about what people fed back, strongly agree or strongly disagree, and I think it was Councillor Battlemuch raised is that there was actually support for a one-off increase in council tax precept, regardless of how difficult, and the focus groups where they fed back on that is that they also wanted to see value for money as well. Certainly the focus group that I attended, they were more than happy in terms of fire and rescue in terms of the amount that was being requested of them, but they did want to see what they were getting from their fire and rescue service in terms of value for money, efficiency and productivity. So they were very informed and actually very engaged in it, and I think we need to keep that conversation with those focus groups going. Over the page onto page 80, what I would sort of say is that public consultation is a great way of as a temperature check, but as an office I'm always going to be guarded. It's not ultimately a decision about whether we should or shouldn't do something, but I think obviously it gives members a richness of a picture from members of the public about how strongly they feel, and that really gauges for me as your chief auditor what are some of the reassurances I would have to give around the difficulties of delivering some of these changes. 2.23 on bottom of page 80, I would talk about, and the Chair's already made this point as well, is that we are in a better position because of the £5 precept in terms of going to council tax financially, but the problem has not gone away. And I will sort of say operational resources, it forms a large part of our budget, and while there's the deficit, I cannot guarantee that we will not back to be looking at operational resources. That is not a reassurance I can give members, given the level of budget commitment that actually the authority has to deliver that service. We will continue now to work as well on future reports to make sure that actually we are getting value for money out of things. And Councillor Quigley talked about the capital programme, making sure we're sweating our assets, and I think we can give some reassurances through the F&R committee, currently chaired by your Councillor Clark, that we'll continue to do that, and that is certainly something that we do on a regular basis, and the team, strategic team recently have made sure we've gone through that in terms of the capital programme. Productivity and efficiency we've kind of talked upon, and I know the Councillor Rosny at the Community Safety Committee, we talked about unwanted fire signals, and we're going to do some additional work to make sure we reassure members that actually what we're proposing operationally is a sound thing to do, but clearly we're going to have to manage public expectation, member reassurance, and also our partners who run some of these larger establishments, and then engage further with some of the other organisations that we go to in terms of a regular basis. And I know certainly from the Fire Brigade Union there was some fear, I think it was one of the questions around if we don't go to unwanted fire signals, that means we're going to reduce the numbers of fire engines. It's just purely and simply just not true. What we're trying to do there is reduce the demand of going to things we don't necessarily need to go to, so we can engage with communities more around prevention and protection, and use time wisely, and that feeds back into the Minister's expectation about efficiency and productivity. Moving on, Chair, Futures 25, Phase 2, bottom of page 81. That work will continue. We do have one of our area managers dedicated to Futures 25. We need to make sure we give somebody the brain space and time to actually deal with some of the efficiencies. And again, that will be so much more than just about balancing the budget. There's lots of things we talked about. If we're going to get efficient and work towards being outstanding, we need to make sure our systems and processes are good and fit for the future, and that will certainly be work that we'll do. And again, on productivity, with all that we said about the challenges of last year, we've probably had for the last financial year our most productive year as a fire and rescue service. We've seen continued increases in safe and well visits, and I fully expect those to continue over the next 12 to 24 months as well. Business safety checks in terms of our operational fire crews going around in terms of buildings, the lower levels of risk in terms of temperature checking, the status of fire risk management in properties. And our fire protection inspections are going up as well, despite some challenges with personnel and resources in that team. So despite all those challenges last year, there's some real indicators there about just how much this organisation is doing. Increasing productivity as well. That is being fed right into HMI. So HMI now, in terms of data gathering, again, they'll start to see what this organisation is actually doing. Moving down to 2.37, Futures 25, it talks about there is about, it helps you to set your balanced budget clearly. It is balancing resourcing to risk both operationally and non-operationally as well. So where are we focusing our prevention? And one of the moves we did as a result of some works at Mansfield, we relocated our North prevention team to the Ashfield area around space and focus, and I've had some good feedback from the officers in Ashfield about how we seem to be a bit more visible in the Ashfield area now as well. So that is some really good feedback from the Ashfield District Council themselves. And also where we're seeing changes in risk across the organisation. So some departments we might see moves from one department resources to another department, and that's just where the demands of the modern workplace now is, and that work will carry on throughout 2023. And moving down as well in terms of your using of your earmark reserves. So we've already talked about that in terms of Becky and the great work here and the team have been doing, and using £400,000 of the 1.12 million for the last year. And finally, Chair, in terms of the long-term strategic partnerships, those we hope that we can put some more work and effort into that now. Should industrial action not take place, we won't be doing lots of resilience planning, and that has just been absorbing so much energy out of the organisation. It's unreal, really. And I think we've actually maintained industrial relations pretty well as well on the back of that. I might get a wry smile from the FBU colleagues, but I believe that to be the true. So hopefully around long-term strategic partnerships, we can start to put some positive energy into that, and hope when we get to the 6th of March and the ballot comes back, we'll know very quickly about whether we're going to have to enact any of that, or actually we can get people's lives back to normal. So there's obviously lots in there, Chair. There's a couple of recommendations. I'm sure members will want to kind of debate stuff. So one of the key things is I'm not recommending that we take what we went out to consultation as any cuts at this time, but I do have to reiterate there remain an option for you potentially of that part of your savings plan going forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Craig. And just before I open up for discussion and debate, just put on record my thanks to you, Craig. And I know the senior leadership team have worked really hard on this report. But, you know, their individual colleagues, Lena and Andy, but also Mick and Candida and yourself and Becky have worked really, really hard on what I know has been a very difficult report to land in terms of the impact it has on the individual service. I just want to reiterate and stress, we talked about this in the previous budget meeting, that I think the best way to describe this is we've won a reprieve, and unless something improves next year in the financial position, we will have to come back and be looking at frontline service cuts again. So we've got a year to try and exert whatever pressure we can on central government to get an uplift in funding and to maybe be given flexibility in council tax again, but that alone will not be enough. There will need to be some redress in terms of those disparities that I talked about earlier. With that in mind, I'm going to move to, from the Chair, additional recommendations. I'm going to ask for a seconder for the recommendations. So the recommendations as spelled out in the report currently are that it's recommended that members note the outcomes of phase 1 of the workforce review, including the associated exempt report relating to discretionary compensation payments to affected individuals. Secondly, that we receive further reports from the Chief Officer. Third recommendation, which I'm moving from the Chair and I would ask for a seconder, is to agree not to remove the second appliance from London Road and Stockhill stations, and to agree not to convert West Bridgeford station from one whole-time appliance to one day shift crewing appliance. Councillor Ifadora is going to second that recommendation.
Seconded.
And the fourth recommendation, which is a recommendation I'm moving from the Chair, is to, he doesn't need to be instructed, it's referenced in 2.25 of the report, but to instruct the Chief Fire Officer to swiftly work up and implement proposals at Ashfield Fire Station to address the identified gap in resourcing to risk faced by the community in Ashfield, which is obviously referenced specifically in black and white by the Chief Fire Officer. He's alluded to it in 2.25 in the report. I'd ask for a seconder for that recommendation. Councillor Zadrozny to second the recommendation. Yeah. So there are two additional recommendations to the two recommendations that are in the report, so that members have actually taken a decision on the advice that were being given by the Chief Fire Officer. Any comments or questions in relation to the report? Councillor Zadrozny, Councillor Clark, and then Councillor Rain. Councillor Zadrozny.
Firstly, Chair, thank you for that. I know this has been a very difficult and challenging time, and I welcome the fourth recommendation, obviously. It's something we've been working on from Ashfield since 2018. I always thought it was a detrimental, harmful decision. And I'm really pleased that we can work on something coming back as swiftly as possible, and I'm very keen on the word swiftly as well. It's a very important thing to me. I want to thank you for the time that you and I have had discussing possible options, and also the Chief Fire Officer for that as well. And I look forward to either through committee or through the full fire authority, something coming back that remedies what is clearly an evidence-based lead in Ashfield as swiftly as possible, and I'll be keeping a watching brief. But I want to thank you for that opportunity. Residents of Ashfield have spoken very loudly that they feel at unease about what's happened, and I'm very hopeful that we can rectify that quickly. I'm very disappointed to see in the public consultation that not all members of Parliament fed that into the consultation, and the councils did, parish councils did, and lots of members of the public. but I would be hopeful that there was more cross-party support for those recommendations. I don't want to labour the point, Chair, but I'm grateful, but I really do hope, Craig, it's coming back soon. Thank you.
It's fair to say Chief Fire Officer's heard your message loud and clear.
I think
And let me just say as well to you and Councillor Hollis, I thank you for the way in which you've engaged in the conversation, because you've appreciated the financial position facing the service and have engaged constructively, and I think that's to your credit, and I'm certainly very grateful for it. As you said, there is an evidence-based risk there, and in my view we've got to close that risk down, and the Chief Fire Officer is crystal clear about that, and I know he's already started some work, but very grateful for the way that both you and Councillor Hollis have engaged in the conversation, Jason. Councillor Clark and then Councillor Rain.
Yeah, thanks, Chairman. I'll go along with Jason on that. I just added probably a fifth recommendation. Could we have a timescale on it? We made that decision, I think, reluctantly some time ago. I think it's probably proven in your geographical place is important that we do something quite urgently in that area. So supporting Jason, supporting yourself on the recommendations, I would like to see a timescale so it doesn't go off into the ether. We get something back and at least our staff know where they are and the public know where they are in Ashfield.
Yeah, thanks, John. I mean, the word swiftly has been put in there, and I think Craig's heard it loud and clear. I know he's had a conversation with Councillors Rosny and Councillor Hollis, and he'll work as quick as he can. I don't want to set him an arbitrary timeline and then we fall short of it, because there'll be an expectation from residents in Ashfield, and actually we'll be letting them down and members of the service down. So I think the word swiftly gives Craig a really crystal clear picture, and I think he's heard what you've said, John, on public record, and Craig will take note of that and the comments that have been made by Councillors Rosny. And I appreciate the point you're making, John. It's a point I've made privately to the Chief as well, and it's a point I know he agrees with. Councillor Rain.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, and thanks for the report. I mean, obviously, I'm delighted with parts of it. I think, we've done a consultation, we've listened to the public, that's how it seems to me. I've been lobbied. I mean, I'm particularly happy, obviously, with the second appliance not being removed from Stock Hill. I was lobbied by people who work there, the trade unions and local residents. We've had a stressful year in Baseford. We lost the library and now we lost the fire appliance, and that's not taken into account. It just serves Baseford, it serves Junction 26, the whole of the north of Nottingham. I'm also delighted about London Road, because obviously, when the fire chief's talking about reductions in our staff, and it's, we're losing 11%, on average is 3%, and we've got more and more complex buildings, particularly in the south of the city. When I go and watch Notts win at home, I'm looking at new buildings going up all the time. And some of which, I'm not in the fire service, must be much more difficult if there's a major incident and probably require more people. And I'm also glad that my colleague over there and residents of West Bridgeford get what they've got out of it in terms of it as well. I think in terms of the questionnaires, I was slightly concerned in terms of the numbers. I know the Chief's mentioned that. I think it's great that we've had some from West Bridgeford, particularly other areas, and perhaps we need to look at that. And I mentioned perhaps looking at income of people who respond going forward. But I don't want to make too many contentious points here, but you do feel precarious when the Chief's telling us that, the deficit we potentially got, and the Chair saying we can come back to these cuts next year. The effect it has on us is difficult. It's much more stressful for our staff, colleagues and people who represent, where they're thinking, well, this could come back year after year after year. We need a solution for it. It's marvellous that we've had a reprieve, and I know how unpopular some of these cuts would have been. But it's a case of, are we going to come back to it next year? And that's the worry, isn't it? It is a bit doom and gloom. At the moment, last night when I was reading statements, I was absolutely delighted. And I know residents and people I represent will be. But it's there, but for the grace of God, we go next year, isn't it? So, but thank you for your report.
Thank you, Councillor Rain. Any other comments or questions? Councillor Wheeler?
Yeah, well, obviously, I'm not going to hide my delight at the third recommendation down there. And obviously, thank you for the work that's gone into strategy. I think, like I say, as you said, we've got to be cautious with this. We know that this is 1 year from now, but obviously, as we've mentioned earlier, we're going to do all we can to secure funding in the long term so that we don't have to readdress this. Can you just clarify, again, obviously no problem with the fourth one about Ashfield, just how that comes back for decision making, just so we're clear, so people are asked across the room. And just so I get the wording right, so do you mind just reading out the additional ones again, Michael, if you don't mind? Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Cheers.
Craig, do you want to say something about? I mean, my view of this would be, of course, Craig can bring something back to full fire authority. or a committee, he's the chief fire officer and he's discharged with operational responsibility. And if we give him a clear instruction and a decision, in my view, he needs to get on with working up those proposals and get them implemented ASAP. Craig will obviously want to take a view of that outside here about whether it does need to come back and get members' approval. But the whole idea of giving him a clear recommendation is to give him a clear recommendation so he knows members have got a decision. But I think the swiftly word is absolutely critical. Craig, do you want to say anything?
Yes, yeah. I suppose coming up with the options is relatively straightforward.
Yeah.
It's how do you deliver that recommendation, given the fact that the chair's already said it's within your financial envelope.
That's
and I know,
the point.
and I know the comments from the FBU on their statement about shouldn't be detrimental to other stations. I haven't got a number of firefighters I can go down the road and get off a shelf. I'm not getting any more money than the Fire Authority given me, so it's within the financial envelope. That comes with some internal issues about how do you deliver scaled change, and how many people are on board with that change or scrutinising that change or resistant to that change. I believe it should come back here, but as is equally so, you know, that might be something the chair and group leaders you might want to sort of say, well, would you want to discharge that to policy and strategy? I think it's something that does need to come back to Fire Authority to put it in the public domain that we have made a difference to public.
Yeah, and that's sorry to come back. That's why I'm making up that, you know, so we didn't charge a big decision. But as you just hit it on the head, it's a lot of money. We discussed the budget here today, just making sure that there's a full accountability out there that we're not going to be. There might be some people out there thinking, oh, you're going to do that. What you're going to potentially take out somewhere else. I'm not saying it's the case, but we just need to be clear and transparent so we don't get any confusion going forward. That's the point I was making. But no problem. Thank you.
Councillor Battlelodge?
Yeah, I just want to offer my support for the recommendations and, like others have, to say that this is like a short-term victory for us, but, you know, there's a long-term campaign here. It's, you know, concluding the football analogies, it would be like Forest staying up, but then knowing that we're going to have a tough year the year after, and that's what I want to be in. But I want to get into that position where, you know, not only are we saving the services, but we're campaigning year on year to get a better settlement. And I think some of the things that we talked about earlier under different discussions about a longer term financial strategy, not a 1 year on 1 year scenario, about a change of attitude from central government, whether that's by this current government or a change of government when it comes, in terms of the future funding of fire service, is something that we need to keep lobbying on. I think we need, as a result of what's gone off in the last few months, we've had a lot of discussions, we've met local MPs and all the rest of it, but we can't stop that now just because we've got to this point. We've got to continue that. We've got to be asking every elected politician what their, you know, what their views are and how are they going to be coming out and advocating for the fire service. We've got to talk to all of our own respective councils. In terms of the council tax, I think we've got to produce some literature, whether that's digital or paper literature, that goes out to people around the time of the council tax increase, because whilst it is only a, you know, relatively small amount for some people, nevertheless it will add to the overall council tax burden. But we need to be saying this is what it's paying for. And I think there will be a resonance for that. We've got to continue the partnership with the workforce trade unions in terms of campaigning for the service, because the people who work for the service are the best advocates for the service. They know where the issues are. I think they do an excellent job campaigning, not just the FBU but Unison as well. I think need to be given credit for the campaigning that they've done. So I think that there is stuff here for us all to take away. I think we've got a relief that we're not facing immediate service cuts. We've got a difficult budget situation coming up over the next few years. We need to campaign like we've never done before to promote and protect the fire service. And from a partisan point of view, I think this probably won't change until we get a change of government, but that's my opinion.
Thank you, Councillor Battlelodge. Chief, did you want to come back?
Yeah, just a little bit about, I think, you know, we're certainly not going to be passive as officers. I've already got a letter drafted that I'll now share with the chair to go to MPs about, you know, where we are financially, but however, this to kind of come, and I guess really recognition from previous with the work that the engagement MPs have had with us last year as well. And that's got to start, and I think really part of our work is, you know, what is the campaign or the approach to be proactive rather than passive. I see more success in some areas, you know, across the fire sector, and I don't know why that is, but I see more success whether it's the strength of voice or the particular issues they have geographically. But we'll start that with a letter going to the chair in terms of a draft, and then the chair can obviously put his spin on it as the chair of the fire authority to go to MPs.
Thank you, Councillor Rossmuch. Thank you, Chief. Councillor Luke.
Thank you. Obviously, short term, we know we need to fight for more money, we need to fight for the service. Long term, we know devolution is going to make probably a large change going forward. Have you yourself had any conversations about how devolution could change this authority, amalgamations maybe down the line? Do we know anything?
Yeah, I mean, disappointingly, when there was a conversation about devolution, nobody found it fit to even bother coming to speak to the fire authority, despite the fact that the devolution deal made reference to significant elements of protection, community safety, where we've got statutory responsibilities. And I know Caroline shared some of my similar frustrations, because Caroline and I spoke about it at length. Both of us pushed quite hard to say, excuse me, you know, we are here, excuse me, there are a lot of staff who may be impacted by this devolution deal, and actually we'd like to be engaged in a conversation. And subsequently, both of us got separate conversations. I know that Caroline spoke to ministers, I spoke to ministers, lobbied civil servants, and the view at the moment, as it stands, from my understanding, is that it's highly unlikely that the fire service and the police service would be rolled into the mayoralty in the first term. That could change. You know, ministers may change their mind. You know, a mayor, whoever is elected, may decide, you know, to push for a sort of Andy Burnham style devolution instead of a lighter devolution that doesn't include our service. But certainly the noise I'm getting, and I think the noise Caroline's getting at the moment, is that there are some tricky issues, you know, to deal with. And why would you want to take on 2 other additional services that have got some tricky issues to deal with? I think it would be a retrograde step. I think devolution's got to prove itself first. I think whoever the mayor has got to prove that there's some value in an additional elected politician from our area. But yeah, clearly it will have a massive impact. I would suspect, my best guess is, you know, unless a change in government has a change in direction in terms of overall devolution, eventually the police and fire services will be rolled into the mayoralty, I suspect.
Yeah.
Would be my best guess. Some of this will be determined by who wins the mayoral election and who is in government at the time. I think what will be lost, tragically, and you know, this is no reflection on Caroline individually, but I think when the police move from, I'm not the only person who thinks this, people from your party who thought this at the time, when the police moved from the old police authority to the police and crime commissioner, places an awful lot of stress and pressure and accountability on one individual, and an office, but one individual, and a lot of power in the hands of one individual. I think the whole beauty of the fire authority, and people might have criticisms about, you know, the governance model, it's not perfect, there never are any perfect models, is that we come here and we have a debate, by and large, usually respectfully. Earlier on, maybe not so respectfully.
I agree.
But we have a debate, and people have a different point of view, and you put your argument, and people listen to what your argument is, and then in the end we come together and we have a vote. And the beauty is you've got lots of communities around here represented, you've got people from different political parties, people with different viewpoints about the decisions we should make. And I think some of that has been, not all of it, some of that's been lost. There are benefits to the Police and Crime Commissioner model as well that we haven't got, but my best guess would be that the fire and police service will be rolled into the mayoralty eventually, probably in the second term. I think that's what you're hearing, Caroline, isn't it?
I think it's quite difficult because there's 2 separate. There's the Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire, and where it's coterminous. Yeah. It's very easy to bring it into the combined mayor. But when you've got 2 distinct, different Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire forces and fire and rescue services, it's more complicated.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's an appetite for combining of our forces at the moment.
And in the meantime, Jono, we will continue to have a positive working relationship with Derbyshire Fire and Rescue Service and the Police and Crime Commissioner. And I know Caroline talks to her oppo in Derbyshire.
Yeah.
You know, I don't care really whether they're from a different political party. We've got to work with them. You know, they're our colleagues, and actually often we're crossing over the border and, you know, supporting each other. So we'll carry on having that conversation, and we'll carry on making sure we're part of the discussion as well around devolution.
Appreciate it, Chair. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions from colleagues? If not, I'm going to move the recommendations. I'll just reread the last 2 recommendations. So recommendation 3, that members agree not to remove the second appliance from London Road and Stockhill stations, and agree not to convert West Bridgeford Station from one whole-time appliance to one day shift crewing appliance, and that fourthly, we, in accordance with 2.25, that we instruct the Chief Fire Officer to swiftly work up and implement proposals at Ashfield Fire Station to address the identified gap in resourcing to risks faced by the community in Ashfield, which is the wording that is referenced in the report. And, you know, my own view of this is, look, you know, the Chief has got to bring back a proposal, but I'd just say this, you know, why should we be treating the community in Ashfield any differently to the communities around Stockhill, London Road or West Bridgeford? They deserve to be treated with exactly the same respect that we're treating those other communities, and actually they do need to know that. There is a significant anxiety in Ashfield community. I was written to by lots of residents during the consultation, and they need to be given some surety by this decision. As Councillor Hollis said, you know, the strength of the service and support provided to residents in Ashfield will return to where it was previously, and obviously the Chief Fire Officer's got to work up proposals and bring them back, but we're making a decision here today, and we're giving a very clear indication about where we stand as an authority. I'm going to move the 4 recommendations. It's a significant decision about a frontline service, so I am going to ask for a show of hands so it can be properly recorded. And I'm going to take the recommendations on block if colleagues are happy with that. So, all those in favour of the recommendations? All those against? Any abstentions? No. That's unanimous agreement. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you to the Chief Fire Officer for the report, and thank you for the way in which people have engaged in the debate. And thank you to everybody who was involved in the consultation, for the hard work that went in from staff, and particularly for the campaigning. And I just echo what Councillor Battlemuch said. Both Unison and the FBU, I think, did a very good job of setting out some of the facts and figures throughout the consultation. So thank you to everybody for that. The next item on the agenda then is item 9, which is the appointment of the Assistant Chief Fire Officer, which is on page 151 of our agenda pack. I chaired the appointments committee. Recommendation in the report on page 151 is that members agree to the appointment of Mr Damien West to the position of Assistant Chief Fire Officer with effect from the 16th of April 2023, as recommended by the constituted appointments committee. Colleagues will remember that the Fire Authority in September 2022, we agreed that the position of Assistant Chief Fire Officer would be advertised to seek a substantive appointment to the vacancy that we had. A selection process took place. It was extensive. It was thorough. It followed the usual procedure that you would expect. The Service commissioned Real World HR to give professional support in terms of that process, and obviously there was a cross-party panel in terms of the appointments committee. The selection process itself involved applicant screening, initial interviews, profiling, media exercise, a strategic operational assessment, which I think revolved around an operational incident at Nottingham Arena, a stakeholder panel interview with our partners, a report, a presentation and a member panel interview, and it certainly was very thorough. The appointments committee itself met on the 18th of January, and following that process, which is set out in the recommendation, the committee came to a decision that Mr Damien West should be offered the post of Assistant Chief Fire Officer, substantive post, with effect from the 16th of April 2023. Before I remove the recommendation from the Chair and on behalf of the entire Fire Authority, let me also just put on record a personal thanks and a heartfelt thanks to our current incumbent temporary Assistant Chief Fire Officer, Mick Sharman. Mick, you've done an absolutely fantastic job for us. I know it's been a really, really difficult time. Mick will continue to remain in post until the 16th of April to support a smooth handover, and I hope you'll continue to do a fantastic job for us in the service, Mick. You've been absolutely brilliant, and your personal support for me as a chair has been very much appreciated. So please do accept our thanks, Mick, for your outstanding work on behalf of the authority. Are there any other comments or questions, Councillor Whelan?
Yeah, just to briefly say, obviously, congratulations to Damien from our entire group, and we support him in his new role. But again, that's not just because Mick might kick me if I don't say something nice, so he sat next to me, but really want to say thank you to Mick on behalf of the group for everything you've done in your role. I mean, I know from the conversation we had, especially when we went to Fire at County Hall, and the way you were handling that situation briefly to me, and I know the amount of work you've done behind the scenes on some projects. Not all that might come to fruition now, but that's probably that's a good thing in terms of what you've done there. But we know you've really done a fantastic job for us, so very much thank you for what you've done.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Councillor Drosny?
Just quickly to concur, I think obviously we'll support the recommendations, but enormous note of thanks from me personally to Mick. He's by far the most communicative officer at that level I've worked with. Others are exceptional, but Mick's been really gone out of his way to make sure I know what's happening, kept me up to date, and a huge vote of thanks from me as well.
Thank you, Councillor Drosny. You're a first-class public servant, Mick, and certainly in my work with you, you know, that comes across loud and clear, and I'm sure you'll continue to be a first-class public servant for us, so thank you, Mick. Okay, so the recommendation is as set out on page 151. All those in favour? All those against? Any abstentions? Congratulations to Damien, who I know will do a very good job for us. The next item on the agenda then is item 10, which is the report of the Independent Remuneration Panel. We're legally required to respond to, obviously, the independent report, and it's a requirement that they come together and give a view about members' allowances, and I think the clerk is going to speak to what is actually a very self-explanatory report.
It is self-explanatory. It tidies up one anomaly that we have in relation to the way that inflators are applied to members' allowances. Normally it's linked to the percentage increase on the National Insurance Council pay rate, so the amount awarded to white-collar staff. Unfortunately, or fortunately, on this occasion the amount awarded to staff was a flat rate of £1,925, which would be inappropriate to allocate to members' allowances. So the Independent Remuneration Panel have looked at a model that could be used, and what they are recommending is a 4.04% increase, which is the same model that's been used at Nottinghamshire County Council and has been approved at that authority, and they view it as a reasonable proposal and recommended to you.
Thank you very much, Clark. I'm not going to speak to this report. It's self-explanatory. It's an independent report. I've never thought members should get into the business of tinkering around with you know, their own allowances. It's been suggested by the independent panel. They obviously think it's an appropriate model. It's the model that's been adopted at the County Council. People will note that the percentage is significantly below that percentage which has been offered in the pay award to our firefighters, which I think is the right place to be given the cost of living crisis. We have to play our part as well as members, but also members do a difficult job and a good job, and they should be recompensed to do the difficult job that they do. So the recommendation is there on page 155, which is that members' basic and special responsibility allowances be increased by 4.04%, backdated to the 1st of April 2022, in line with the proposal put forward by the Independent Remuneration Panel, which Clark has spoken to. Any comments or questions? If there aren't any comments and questions, I'm going to move the recommendation. All those in favour? All those against? Any abstentions? That's unanimously agreed. Thank you very much, colleagues, and thank you to the clerk for his work, and also please express our thanks to the independent panel for their work as well. Malcolm. Item 11 then is committee outcomes, which people will have seen in the supplementary pack on page 15 to 50 in the supplementary pack. Are there any comments or questions colleagues would like to raise in terms of committee outcomes? No? People have to approve them? Yeah. Thank you very much. Item 12 then is to exclude the public. So
yeah, before we go to that, can I just say a few words?
Of course you can. Of course you can, Councillor Trimble. Yeah.
I might have been a councillor for a long time, but I've only been a very short time on this committee. And I think the thing that comes across to me is the commitment right across the board, from the management right through to the staff. This committee, I think, a fantastic committee. Trade unions, great actually. Reminds me some of my times when I was a member of the National Union of Mine Workers in the 1970s and 80s, in a very good way, I have to say. So I just think the commitment right across the board has been absolute first class. I think it's a great committee, and it's done great work. And the thing that's better is the passion for the committee, the commitment to the public, I think, shines right through everything that we've done in this last year. I'm sure long before I was on it, and long after I've left it. So thanks very much. I think it's been a great experience for me in my last year's member of council.
Thank you, Councillor Trimble. I was delighted when we heard that you were joining the committee. You've been as you always have in certainly my dealings with you when you were at the City Council and in various cabinet roles and other civic roles that you've held. You've been absolutely brilliant, and I think you've brought real value to the authority and certainly to the city, and you've definitely changed people's lives for the better over the time of your public service. So thank you, and it's very kind of you to have said what you've said about the service, and I know it will be appreciated by people who work for the Service Council Trumbull, so thank you very much. I'm going to move the motion then to exclude the public from the meeting for the remaining two items that we need to consider. So to consider excluding the public from the meeting during consideration of the following item in accordance with section 100A of the Local Government Act 1972 under Schedule 12A Part 1 paragraphs 1, 2 and 3 on the basis that, having regard to all the circumstances, the public interest in, just a bit quiet from colleagues at the back please, that public interest in maintaining the exemption outweighs the public interest in disclosing the information. I'll move the recommendation. Colleagues happy to agree?